Good evening, one and all. I am Nikhil, third year BCom student of Seshadripuram Evening Degree College. Hope everyone is safe during the pandemic. Welcome to the 30th International Webinar of Seshadripuram Evening Degree College on Digital Humanities, Session 3. At the outset, I am happy to inform you all that our evening college is celebrating its Golden Jubilee this year. On behalf of our college, we congratulate all the stakeholders. Department of English, in association with Emory University, Atlanta, US, is organizing international webinar on the digital humanities, session 3. Today's webinar is fully hosted by the students of Seshadripuram Evening Degree College. I request everyone to kindly pardon us in any case of mistakes.
Happy evening to India and a very happy morning to United States. I take this opportunity to welcome you all for this international webinar in association with Emory University, Atlanta, United States. At the outset, I would like to thank all the office bearers for this great institution and welcome all of them. Now, I would like to introduce and welcome the first theme speaker, Dr. Lauren F. Klein, Associate Professor, Departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods, Emory University, Atlanta, US. Madam is an Associate Professor in the Departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Humanities Lab. Before moving to Emory, she taught in the School of Literature, Media and Communication at Georgia Tech. Ma'am works at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, and early American literature with a research focus on issues of gender and race. She has designed platforms for exploring the contents of historical newspaper, modeled the invisible labor of women abolitionists, and recreated forgotten visualization schemes with fabric and addressable LEDs. In 2017, she was named one of the rising stars in digital humanities by Inside Higher Ed. She is the author of An Archive of Taste, Race and Eating in the Early United States and with Catherine D'Ignazio, Data Feminism. With Matthew K. Gold, she edits Debates in the Digital Humanities, a hybrid print digital publication stream that explores debates in the field as they emerge. Her current project, Data by Design, an interactive history of data visualization 1786 to 1900, was recently funded by an NEH Mellon Fellowship for Digital Publication. Ma'am, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I welcome you to this webinar. I am happy to introduce and welcome today's another theme speaker, PP Sneha, Program Manager and Researcher at Center for Internet and Society, Bengaluru, India. Madam is a researcher with the Center for Internet and Society, Bangalore, India. Her training is in English literature and she was previously worked in the area of access to higher education. Her work at Center for Internet and Society primarily engages with shifts in modes and practices of knowledge production in the humanities and arts with the digital turn. Her areas of interest include methodological concerns in arts and humanities, digital media and cultures, higher education and pedagogy, and access to knowledge. She worked on a report on mapping digital humanities in India in 2016. Her work has been published in a special volume of the Debates in DH series on maker cultures in the humanities and in a collection of essays in computational cultures in India. Her recent work includes writing on the digital turn in archival practices in India and exploratory research and collaborative work on mapping digital language practices and efforts to create a multilingual internet. Ma'am, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I wholeheartedly welcome you for this webinar. Due to technical issues, Nadoja Dr. Wooday Krishna sir is unable to join us today for the webinar. He feels really bad for the issue and sends his best wishes for the success of this webinar. I now welcome our beloved principal, Professor N.S. Satish sir, to this international webinar. Welcome, sir. I welcome all the office bearers and trustees of Seshadripuram Educational Trust and all the principals of our sister institutions, other heads of the institutions, conveners, volunteers, and all participants who have registered across the globe. Now, I welcome Dharappa Kunnur sir, Program Coordinator, and Sunil Kumar ji sir, Coordinator IQAC. And finally, I welcome our own teaching and administrative faculty to this webinar. Thank you, one and all.
May I now request the first theme speaker, Lauren F. Klein, Associate Professor, Department of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods, Emory University, Atlanta, US, to enlighten us on the topic of digital humanities and data justice, lessons from intersectional feminism. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. So what I want to do today is talk about digital humanities in relation to the growing field of data justice. So data justice is an interdisciplinary field that considers how the collection, analysis, and use of data relate to issues of social justice. And today I'll be talking about how feminism and intersectional feminism in particular can help us develop more ethical and equitable data practices, both in the digital humanities and beyond. So I should mention also that much of the content from this talk comes from a book that I co-authored with Professor Catherine D'Ignazio, who is an assistant professor of urban science and planning at MIT. And you can see her information on this slide. Oh, and I should also mention that the book is available open access online. So if you Google data feminism, MIT Press, you should be taken to the website and you can read the book online there. It's the same as the print edition, just in digital form. And we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that is working to hold corporate and government actors accountable for their sexist, racist, classist data products. So you might think of face detection systems that cannot see people with dark skin, hiring algorithms that automatically demote applicants that went to all women's schools. Just in the past few months, we heard about the A-level exam grade algorithm that gave students who had attended schools in poorer neighborhoods lower scores automatically, and then increased the grades of those who came from fancier neighborhoods. You know, it was really the fact that these examples really just keep coming. I'm sure there's sort of a new one this past week. The idea that these algorithms keep on presenting themselves is essentially what motivated us to write the book. Whereas you see these multinational corporations talking about data as what they describe as the new oil. And they mean this in a good way. Data seems to them as sort of this untapped natural resource that can lead to profit for them once it's processed and refined. You see women, and particularly women of color, as well as indigenous people, immigrant communities, and more, experiencing this very same process of data extraction. Since if you're talking about oil, that's really what the metaphor is. They experience this as just another instance of the same form of oppression that has been familiar. And in the book, we are very clear that we are not the first ones to have made this case that this oppression is real and it's ongoing and it's necessary to dismantle. But what we try to do in the book is explain how feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, has been focused on dismantling instances of oppression and the forces of power that cause them for a very long time. So what we try to do in the book is take these sort of contemporary instances of oppression via data and algorithms and attach them to this very long history of feminist activism that has been interested in stopping these instances of oppression, not necessarily in a digital or a data-driven context, but more generally, feminism gives us these models that we can then apply. So I've been talking about feminism so far, and it really does mean many things to many different people. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes to do some level setting about how we use the term in the book. So what you see here is actually an image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards. This is when Beyonce projected the word feminist behind her because she sang a song called Flawless, which is about feminism. And in the song, she actually samples a speech by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is quoting what turns out actually just to be the American Heritage Dictionary definition of the term. So you hear Adichie In the Beyonce song, "Speak this definition, feminist, the person who believes in equal rights for men and women," to which we add, "and non-binary people." So what we get from this very basic definition is that feminism is, at its core, a belief in equality. Now, if you look in the dictionary, there are a couple of definitions for feminism, and the second one is this: organized activity on behalf of women and non-binary people's rights and interests. So what you can take from this definition is that feminism also means political action. And then there's a third definition, which relates to a set of theories and ideas. And these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But the past 40 years of scholarship, and then really just sort of the current global political reality, have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include race, these include class, these include sexuality, ability, location in the world, and more. And so this conversation about the many dimensions of feminism brings me back to this idea of intersectional feminism, which I began my talk by mentioning. And in our view, and this is what we say in the book, is that when you talk about feminism in the year 2020, when the book came out, it must be understood as intersectional. So what do we mean by this? Intersectionality is a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which she uses to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, like gender. When we're talking about inequality or oppression, we must be talking about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. And she means this actually in a very literal sense. She talks about the metaphor of the intersection of a street, so multiple forces and factors coming together and crossing, sometimes in a messy way. The really key thing to understand about intersectionality, and this is actually something that's often overlooked in casual invocations of the term, is that intersectionality doesn't just describe markers of individual identity and their effect. So it doesn't just mean, I am, a white cisgender professor, tenured, lives in the global north and the US South. It doesn't just mean these things about me. What it is actually trying to describe are the structural forces of power and their intersection that create the effects that I experience as a result of my identity. And it's really the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about the root cause of the instances of either oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other that any particular individual or group faces. This conversation about forces of power, that's where we credit Black feminism for bringing questions of power to the fore. In today's world, data is power. You see this idea in the idea of data as the new oil. You also see this in the experience of data as the same old oppression. And intersectional feminism is also about power, right? It's about who has power and who doesn't, and how that impacts our experiences in the world. And so essentially, the argument of the book is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. And the argument that I want to make today is that data science, which I sort of see as a larger field, but connected to digital humanities, needs feminism and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances. And I think that those of us who study digital humanities are uniquely positioned to do this interventional data work precisely because we have both the technical skills and knowledge about how to work with data, and because we understand history and theory and culture and context. But I think even more than that, and this is like a less concrete skill that we have, because of our training, because of the kind of work that we do, it's easier for us to see how something as abstract and theoretical like feminist principles can actually be translated quite directly into the technical world. And actually, I would say it was really my experience in digital humanities and my co-author Catherine's, and she works more in design, but we both had these very interdisciplinary backgrounds, and we think this is what enabled us to write the book. And what we did was really to sit down and ask ourselves, what have we learned from all of our schooling in feminist scholarship, from our participation in various activist communities and community groups? How could we distill these into actionable principles? And so you can see here the 7 principles that we came up with that to us encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data. Our goal was really to operationalize feminism for data science, to provide models that might really help guide the work of people working with data, or who want to work with data, or people who want to refuse to work with data. And you can see these principles here. They are examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And so what I'm going to do in the remainder of my talk is just give you a couple of examples of digital humanities projects that engage these principles. I don't have time to go into each principle separately, so I actually tried to pick some projects that brought a couple of the principles together in a single project. And then I'll end with just a couple of concrete things that I think that students and scholars can do in this regard. Oh, and I should mention also, if you like these principles, we also created a sort of infographic that you can in digital and also print form that you can download from our website. So if you go to datafeminism.io, and after this talk, I'll just paste some of these links in the chat, but you can download the principles if you feel like creating a background or printing them out or something like that in a slightly more graphic form. So what did these principles look like in practice? So one example of this kind of work is Mimi Onuoha's Library of Missing Data Sets. Onuoha is an artist and educator and sort of works in sort of an adjacent world to digital humanities. She teaches at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications Program, ITP. And she both teaches technical subjects and creates artworks. And this phrase that you see on the slide, missing data sets, is Onuoha's way of describing data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need, but because of various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So data sets like transgender people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or a more topical example that we're all experiencing right now, a gender or race breakdown of the number of people with COVID in the United States in particular. And a lot of countries don't have gender data on COVID. Onuoha, she exhibits the Library of Missing Data Sets as both a GitHub repository, which is what you can see in the screenshot on the right, and then also an art installation. That's the file cabinet that you see on the left. And you can also Google Mimi Onuoha missing data sets and find the project on GitHub. But in the artwork, the files are labeled with the title of each of the missing data set. And the idea is that in the gallery, you sort of tab through them with your fingers. You find one that looks interesting, you go to open it, but then the folder is empty. And the point that Onuoha wants to make is that they are empty because of a lack of personal, social, political, or governmental will, or sort of some combination of these. And these are the forces of power that the principle of examining power points us towards. So the first step involved in data feminism is examining these forces of power that determine what data are collected in the first place and what data are not, or in turn, what research is undertaken and what research is not. And once we understand how these forces of power operate, then we can start to take steps to rebalancing these forces of power, redirecting our research, and beginning to affect change. So one of my sort of favorite digital humanities projects ever, which really exemplifies this goal of examining unequal power relations and challenging that power through a digital humanities project, is the one that you see here. This is called the Colored Conventions Project. So these were events that took place in the 19th century in the United States, in which Black Americans, so both those fugitive, those who had escaped from slavery, and those who were free, they gathered in person to strategize about how to achieve legal justice, social justice, economic justice, educational justice. So just sort of a little bit of context on the abolitionist movement in the United States. So the standard story of abolition is one that credits the white abolitionists in the North for leading the cause of emancipating enslaved people in the South. But this is primarily because the efforts of these white abolitionists were recorded in newspapers, which, because they had access to print technologies, could document their efforts. They were also preserved because they were perceived as very important in their own time. Because they were preserved in their own time, they have since been digitized. And so they're easy to access for researchers today. You know, if you're looking for information about the 19th century abolitionist movement, you can go to a big database of these newspapers and read them. And on the converse of that, these in-person organizing meetings that were held by the very people who were trying to advocate for their own liberation, because these were held in person, conversationally, the minutes of these meetings are far less easy to access today. So in this case, the forces of power that the Color Conventions Project seeks to challenge are essentially the forces of power that control the historical narrative. We might call this sort of the power of the archive, right? So you might think of, you know, Jacques Derrida, Michel Rolph-Trouillot, Saidiya Hartman, you know, people who theorize the construction of the archive. And among the goals of the project, this particular project, is to create a machine-readable corpus of the meeting minutes so that the meeting minutes can be incorporated into large-scale analyses of that era and essentially restore credit to the Black Americans who were actively working for their own abolition, but tend to be overlooked in the dominant historical accounts of that time. I'm going to turn to an example that illustrates another principle about embracing pluralism. It's also, in effect, this is something that we might call, like the Color Conventions Project, a counter data collection effort. So identifying data that does not exist and then undertaking that data collection project on your own in order to fill in the gap. And what you see here is one of the maps created by the San Francisco-based anti-eviction mapping project. So they go as the AEMP. It's a collective, actually. So they just credit all of their work to the AEMP. But in this audience, it's worth pointing out that actually the project includes several humanities grad students in leadership roles. And actually, some of them have graduated and now they are working with community organizations, in postdocs, and in professor roles. In any case, since 2013, so almost 10 years, the AEMP has worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis in the Bay Area on the West Coast of the United States. This is, of course, where all of Silicon Valley is. And in the past 10 years, there's been a real problem where people, tech workers coming to that area to work at these companies with very high salaries, move in, and because they can afford higher rents, the landlords raise the rent and kick out the people who have lived there for many years. What the AEMP has tried to do is document places where people or families have been evicted. And so that's what you see in the red dots on the map. And then they also interviewed some of these families. So each of the blue dots that you see on the map indicate a video interview. If you click on one of the blue dots, you can watch one of these videos on the right. In the book, we contrast the work of the AEMP with the work of another group that is focused on the same issue of eviction, the Eviction Lab, which is based at Princeton University. The Eviction Lab's goal is related. It's to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And I should say, I'm not critiquing the goal of this project. I just want to look at the difference in terms of methods. And this project is equally worthy and valuable. So what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the Eviction Lab's map, if you look at it, it seems like it's drawing from a bigger data set, right? We're looking at a map of the whole United States, not just one area of it. It seems like the dots seem to sort of represent more people. It seems like we're getting a more comprehensive picture of the task at hand. You might even also think about what the maps look like, right? This one was automatically generated, I think, using Mapbox. I'm not entirely sure. The other one appears to be some sort of Google Map handmade kind of thing. This one adheres to standard visualization best practices. The other one, I can talk a little bit more about that later, but does not, about why it's interesting that they don't, and they choose not to, but it doesn't. But What the AEMP has shown is that these national real estate databases, like the one that the eviction lab uses, actually significantly undercount evictions. If you think for a minute about why this might be true, you can think about, and I think that students experience this a lot, at least in the US, there are a lot of ways that you can be sort of forced to leave your home in ways that aren't counted officially as an eviction, right? So to be evicted formally in the US, you, the landlord, need to go to the city government, fill out some paperwork, get something, file a request for eviction. You're given a document, you go to the person's house and you deliver them a paper, an eviction notice. That is then it gets counted as an eviction in this database. But there are all sorts of ways that you can get kicked out or be forced to leave or encouraged to leave that don't involve that official process. The landlord can, not fix the leak in your ceiling for months and make your apartment uninhabitable. They can use their key to come in and, interrupt your privacy. They can make it uncomfortable for you to live there. They can just raise your rent a lot frequently. These are all ways that are in effect evictions, because that is the goal of the landlord, getting you out so they can get someone else new in who they can charge more. But they don't show up in the database. Because the AEMP has been working with these community groups, with these tenants' rights organizations, so the groups in the community where if you are experiencing some of this behavior, you go and you say, help me, what should I do? And the AEMP counts that as a potential eviction. What they have gathered is actually a more accurate picture of who is being evicted in this particular area. It is probably messier. It's probably messier data, harder to work with. But it actually documents a greater extent of the problem at hand, which is the goal of both projects. And in the book, we talk about this as what is gained by embracing pluralism, by which we mean bringing multiple voices to the project design table. I just have one last example to share before I try to summarize. So the previous examples have focused on the issue of power and people. So sort of people who have power and people who don't. But another major idea that comes from feminism and feminist theory relates more to sort of conceptual structures of power, and more specifically, sort of binary structures that you might think of as being defined by a hard distinction between two groups. So feminist theory has helped to show how these binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy, with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And once you start to see the hierarchy, you start to understand a little bit about why the hard line between the groups is there in the first place. And it's to ensure that the one group on the bottom stays on the bottom and isn't able to sort of push their way up and encroach upon the territory and power of the other. Obviously the distinction between the idea of, man and woman, this is the obvious reference point, right? Because we can understand how historically this has been a binary, right? This projection of only two genders. And there's also sort of an implicit, it's a very clear example, as we know now, of both a false binary and an unequal hierarchy, right? So there are more than two genders, and among them, no gender is inherently better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and use this conceptual model to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. Identify sort of how culture has imposed this artificial distinction or hard line between two groups, and then to try to show how these groups have been placed in a hierarchical relation when in fact this hierarchy should not exist. And so you can think about this in the relationship between, for example, nature and culture. There is not, in fact, a hard distinction between these two things, and we shouldn't prioritize culture over nature for any particular reason. You can think about this in terms of the relationship between the subject and object of knowledge, teacher and student, things like this, or the example that this particular example takes up, the artificial distinction between reason and emotion. I should sort of qualify this by saying this is sort of an Anglo-Western argument, but I think that it applies globally and for the most part. So in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. So best practices for data visualization often involve like a clean design, minimalist aesthetic, just the facts, this kind of thing. But the question remains, why are these our best practices, especially when research in the same field of visualization has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. So when we see a clean, minimalist chart, we actually tend to believe that this type of chart is more truthful than it actually is. So this example tries to get at the opposite, visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion, like how do they work and how do they affect us? So what you're looking at are actually, in the black images, are actually screenshots of an animated visualization. You can Google this one and find it too. It's by the design firm Periscopic, and it is of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in a particular calendar year. They've done, I believe, 2010, 2013, and most recently 2018. Each of the people killed by a gun in that year is represented as a single arc. And the arcs are traced one by one on the screen, and they start out quite slow so you can read them and follow them with your eye. And then they get faster and faster so that you can't read them anymore individually. And they start to overlap. They create this sort of semicircular web that you see in the larger image. And it keeps on going. It keeps on going for much longer than you think it should. And the effect of watching this is really overwhelming. It's almost unbearable. But that is the point. There are too many people being killed by guns in the United States, right? It's too many to watch because there are too many people actually dying. On the methodological side, it's no less statistically sound than any other study, right? So the data about the people derive from a national crime data set released by the federal government. Their projected lifespans are determined using a model from the World Health Organization, but it was nevertheless viewed with suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel. So a feminist approach here would say, that's not a problem at all that it made us feel things. And in fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. And rebalancing emotion and reason opens up this data communication toolbox that we have and allows us to focus on what truly matters in a design process. So honoring the context of the data, listening to experience, and taking action to challenge the imbalances of power that we encounter in the world. This just brings me to the final point that I want to make, which may already be obvious from these examples, but this data feminist approach requires a bringing together of digital humanities and data science. It's really important not to erect distinctions on the basis of the size of the data set or the technical credentials of the people undertaking the work, because these concerns are usually women and people of color, to exclude work that makes a contribution that is partially humanistic rather than just technical. But if we start to look at these fields together, then what we can see is some of the most exciting data science work is actually being undertaken by digital humanities scholars, in addition to artists and journalists and community organizers and activists. And sure, some of this work does look fairly traditional. And you can see an example of one of these technical papers from Margaret Mitchell and her team at Google AI. She recently has come under fire for her focus on AI ethics. We can talk about that later. But a paper of hers you can see on the far left. But then next to her work, you see an interactive sculpture. You see a digital humanities project about immigration called Torn Apart Separados. It's English-Spanish language DH project. And then at the bottom, you see a mural that involves the data visualization that was painted. It was both created and painted in a community involving the data that represents them. And so these are just some of the ways that we can use data to develop more ethical and equitable data practices and to really call ourselves and our communities to action. Because, one thing is, and Catherine and I try to really emphasize this in the book, we recognize that data is at the root of so many problems today, but it can also be part of the solution. And I personally think that digital humanities has a lot to contribute to that task. So just concretely to close, what are some things that DH students can do? So you can do work that interrogates and exposes sexism, racism, and other forces of oppression. You can examine how these forces show up in data and the world. You can collect counter data and missing data, introduce new communities to data and digital tools, use data to advocate for equity at your institution. You can experiment with creative forms of data presentation and communication. You can include more people in data-driven projects, especially the communities that you are studying. And then make sure that you credit your sources, your research support staff, make your process transparent, and reflect on your own identity. So that's all that I have for me. Thank you for listening. I hope that that was not too long, but more information about the book can be found at this URL. And I'm very interested to hear the rest of the talks today. Thank you so much for listening.
Now I would request our next theme speaker, PP Sneha ma'am, Program Manager and Researcher at Center of Internet and Society, Bengaluru, to enlighten us on the topic of many languages on digital infrastructures.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Professor Klein for that really wonderful presentation. I think data feminism is such an important and timely intervention, I think, in this space. So it was great listening to your talk. And of course, thank you so much to Seshadripuram College, to the English department for organizing this. It's a great space to interact with all of you. And looking forward. So for my talk today, I'll be presenting on some of the work we've been doing at CIS recently, and specifically, I think, some exploratory research and collaborative work on languages and languages in the internet. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we can begin. So for this brief presentation, like I said, these are not specifically digital humanities projects, but I think just, like I said, collaborative work, exploratory research on building a multilingual and accessible internet, and what can we sort of understand from the challenges and sort of broader infrastructural issues with the internet, and how they resonate with concerns in the digital humanities. Right. So the emergence of the field of digital humanities has been a very important development in the way interdisciplinary modes of research and knowledge production have been imagined, particularly with respect to what is seen as the role of digital technologies and the internet in these spaces. So as a field of study that's been premised so much on the digital, the growth, access, and use of internet and digital technologies is integral to much of DH practice, scholarship, and pedagogy. There is also now a substantive body of critique on the field, especially its sort of very Anglo-centric antecedents and specific origin stories in humanities computing and textual studies, etc. Several efforts to decolonize DH have also highlighted visible knowledge gaps in the field, including the need to create a diverse, multilingual, and accessible DH. So I think a lot of the work that Professor Klein was talking about, specifically on intersectional feminism, I think those are sort of important interventions in that space. Efforts within DH to address linguistic barriers in particular have been especially key in countries in the global south. Such efforts, however, are also shaped by larger, persistent infrastructural challenges of the internet itself. So drawing upon some of the work at the Access to Knowledge program at CIS, and specifically on research on Indian language Wikimedia communities, and an upcoming report on the state of the internet's languages. This presentation, I hope will delve into some reflections on efforts and challenges in creating a multilingual internet, and where these sort of efforts may also inform fields like DH. So the discourse around DH as a discipline or field is still developing in the Indian context. And the term has often been reiterated with respect to connections that technology has forged with several areas, such as education, computing, cultural heritage and archival practice, design, maker cultures, so several areas now that have been engaging with, and where there's a lot of collaborative work happening in digital humanities. So this is a sort of definition of DH we came up with in the course of our engagement with the field, specifically when we were working on a report on mapping digital humanities in India. And this is, of course, in our conversations with a larger collective of researchers, practitioners working in the field, called Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations, or Dharti, as you can see on the top left-hand corner. So we basically were looking at specifically in terms of how doing digital humanities in India should speak to and engage with the politics of humanities knowledge specifically, and how humanities disciplines have been evolving and changing with the advent of the internet. So various forms of engagement with the digital by humanities scholars and practitioners, which include developing software, creating new tools and methods for research and practice, producing and reorganizing archives, building theory, and rethinking pedagogy. All of which may allow one to study and work with the digital more critically from the perspective of the humanities disciplines. So this sort of broader critique of DH, the sort of Anglo-centric form of DH that I was talking about, and the general lack of diversity in the field has also been growing, or sort of critique about that has been growing in the last several years. And specifically with the emergence of fields and strands such as post-colonial, feminist DH, the development of collectives like South Asian Digital Humanities, Global Outlook DH, Multilingual DH, etc. Right? So as Domenico Fiermonte notes, the problem is not only that of a difference of methodological approaches and a sort of perceived lack of theoretical framing around tools and platforms, but also due to limitations posed by the geopolitical and cultural linguistic composition of the discipline. So this is further complicated by a set of infrastructural challenges or gaps in the Indian context, most notably in the form of a digital divide, which precedes even the development of the discipline itself. In more recent years, concerns include the growth of a seemingly sort of neoliberal model of education that has brought about drastic changes in the functioning of universities, debates on the privatization of education, the entry of foreign institutions, and increased vocationalization, etc. So even as institutions have been grappling with a lot of basic issues, right, with in terms of access to the internet, developing digital literacy, etc., technology is often seen as a recourse, and this is seen in the urgency of large-scale adoption of digital technologies over the last few years, specifically in terms of policy reforms. So Nishant Shah talks about this, when he observes that policy reform still falls within this broader rubric of infrastructure building, which is geared towards addressing issues of access to education, digital literacy, unemployment, and economic development, with the motive of India becoming a significant player in global information societies. He further argues that the assimilation of digital humanities within this discourse of the state has also led to a flattening of earlier histories of science, technology, humanities, society studies, which were initiated by the state. So that said, there is still kind of significant infrastructural limitations to DH work in India. So Shanmuga Priya and Nirmala Menon, in their work on situated practices in DH in India, reiterate how the lack of specific forms of infrastructure, such as digital humanities labs, DH pedagogy, digital tools and software, and institution and government support has impeded Indian DH scholars or Indian humanities scholars from leveraging the affordances of computational techniques and resources. They further emphasize that the specific deficit of such technologies they further emphasize the deficit of such technologies in the realm of Indian languages in terms of availability of tools and software, and importantly as a gap that is exacerbated by the divide between humanities and computer science. So as mentioned earlier, these are sort of challenges that have predated, even the digital humanities itself, and they continue to exist in the ways in which we imagine and conceptualize digital infrastructures itself, right? So when we think and we imagine broader digital infrastructures, whether it's a platform, whether it is a tool, whether it is an app, how are we thinking of it? In what language are we thinking about it, right? So this is, I think, sort of an important and key point to think about, specifically in the Indian context. So over the last year at CIS, we've been working with two different teams, or I've been working with two different teams on some very exploratory research on digital cultural practices on the internet, and specifically that, with languages. And the first is with the Access to Knowledge program at CIS. And this is, of course, is a program that works very closely with the broader Wikimedia movement. So I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Wikipedia, particularly with students. I think I'm hoping it's a go-to sort of resource, while you're studying. So this is a campaign to promote fundamental principles of justice, freedom, economic development, specifically looking at how best can we create better access to free knowledge, also sort of working with issues like copyright, patents, trademarks, etc. Right? And the specific goal of the team here is supporting Indian Wikimedia communities in different ways, bringing more content under free licenses so that they're more freely available and can be used, designing and executing projects with different communities, and in many ways sort of strengthening the Indian language Wikimedia communities here. So over the course of last year, we've been working on a series of sort of short-term research studies looking at some specific, say, knowledge gaps and areas of work in these communities. This is just a quick sort of snapshot of all the studies that we've been working on. And these are, of course, my wonderful team at CIS who've been working on these projects. So we have sort of work in on the gender gap in Indian language Wikimedia communities, some study on mapping GLAM in Maharashtra. So GLAM is an acronym for Galleries, Libraries, Archives, and Museums. A study on the education program, data gaps on cultural heritage structures of West Bengal on Wikidata, content creation on Punjabi Wikipedia, and a comparative study on article creation campaigns on Wikimedia. So these are all sort of projects that look at very sort of specific aspects of different Indian Wikimedia projects. So I think I can just briefly talk about two of them, which are also published now. So they're actually accessible on our website, and you can look them up on Wikipedia as well. So one is, mapping GLAM in Maharashtra, which was a study on looking at what is the kind of digitized content that is available on cultural heritage resources in Maharashtra. So we did a sort of nice survey of various institutions in Maharashtra. What is the type of content that is available? What formats are they available in? What are sort of challenges with digitization itself? And what are specific challenges with digitizing content in Indian languages? Because a lot of digital humanities work is very dependent also on having a corpora of digitized content, right? So what are the barriers in terms of bringing more content online? And specifically, what are barriers with bringing content in Indian languages on the internet? The other study that we did on Wikidata, so these are all sort of sister projects of Wikipedia. I'm sure you're most familiar probably with Wikipedia, but Wikidata is again a sister project that is again a multilingual collaborative sort of resource, secondary database of structured data on Wikipedia. So it basically pulls all the data that is available on various Wikimedia projects, Wikicommons, Wikipedia, so all of these, the structured data or metadata that you have on all of these projects is sort of brought together on Wikidata, which helps you find content on Wikipedia more easily. So again, this study, and this has, I would say, sort of close links that way to work that is being done in digital humanities as well. This sort of project looked at what kind of missing data points are there in terms of cultural heritage structures in West Bengal, and what are reasons for that. So, some very interesting sort of observations that came up, which with respect to documentation, difficulties in like sort of mapping specific kinds of structures or specific kinds of, say, monuments, cultural heritage structures in different parts of the city. So these were kind of interesting observations that came up from these projects. So I think each of these projects sort of touches on an interesting aspect of what are challenges with Indian languages on the internet, whether it is in terms of content, whether it is in terms of digitization itself, whether it is in terms of translation. I think that's a very important sort of area of work again. Gender, I think, a sort of very persistent and systemic issue, something that is sort of prevalent in various spaces and spheres of of our online sort of lives, but also takes on a very kind of specific kind of form, say in collaborative communities of work, such as Wikimedia. So I'll just quickly move on to the next sort of projects that we've been working on. So this is a project called State of the Internet's Languages. Basically, it's a report on the current state of languages on the internet, with a focus on the use of languages by marginalized communities, writing, speaking, reading multiple languages on the internet, right? The experiences of marginalized communities. So this is a project led by a collective called Whose Knowledge, in collaboration with Oxford Internet Institute and CIS. And the aim is really to present stories and data on languages online. So as part of this work, we've been kind of really holding the stories aspect of this report. And for that, we put out a call for contributions and reflections on how people were approaching, the idea of decolonizing the internet's languages. And there was so much interest. There was, a good sort of response really to something like this. We had over 50 submissions spanning over 38 languages. A majority of them coming from the Indian subcontinent, Africa, and Latin America. And people sort of really shared their stories of how they were using the internet or having difficulties in using the internet in their languages, right? Or how were they what different ways did they use the internet? And were they developing something, were they technologists? Were they, readers? Were they consumers? Were they using an app? So I think these were sort of different stories, and that really kind of really opened up for us many interesting ways in terms of understanding what is the state of the internet's languages today. So this is just a sort of quick snapshot of the stories that you will get to read in the report soon, and they look at very sort of specific areas of different kinds of initiatives in different languages across the world. So whether it's indigenous emojis in Australia, feminist and human rights content in Sinhalese, Sri Lanka, Hindi and Bengali content for persons with disabilities. This is by an Indian contributor. Missing information on LGBTQI issues in Bahasa, Indonesia, and social media. The Chindali language, this is what is its sort of prevalence online. Arabic content creators in Tunis, indigenous languages of Turtle Island within the Twitter ecosystem, Zapotec languages and oral traditions on the web, teaching Mapuzgun online, and technological challenges of minority languages. So this is just, sorry, it's a very sort of full slide, but I'm just doing a quick run through of all the stories. I think I can just sort of quickly sum up some of the key themes and questions that have really emerged from the work that we've been doing, both with Wikimedia and with Wikimedia projects and with now the State of the Internet's Languages report. So I think one important question, from the get-go really is how do we understand something like decolonizing, right? So what are inherent complexities of that discourse? Who are we as decolonial subjects? How do we understand different kinds of languages, So colonized, marginalized languages, disappearing languages, endangered languages, right? And how are all of these found or represented on the internet? I think that's a sort of really key question to engage with, either sort of in different ways that we individually access it or in the form of, like, say, a collaborative encyclopedia like Wikipedia. This was sort of, something to really think of. Intersectionalities, so disparities in the development of multilingual content on the internet and its implication within and perpetuation of systemic inequalities. So like Professor Klein pointed out, when you think of intersectional feminism, there are so many other systemic kind of issues, systemic asymmetries of power, right? So whether it is race, whether it is caste, whether it is class, that sort of intersect and really complicate how we understand something like feminism, for instance, or even in this case, I think linguistic barriers and disparities in the development of multilingual content. There is, of course, a continuing digital divide, linguistic barriers and lack of digital literacy. So whether it is in terms of platforms, fonts, tools, content management systems, these are there are very particular and very sort of difficult issues or areas of work, let's say, for particularly for Indian languages. So content management systems and processes of translation, digitization, archiving, which inherently, of course, have their own sort of challenges in particular contexts. But I think specifically with Indian languages, there are sort of, this is more sort of work that needs to go in. So then of course, forms and formats. The internet is still primarily visual and textual, right? A lot of the content that we engage with on the internet still very much focuses on visual content, textual content. So what are other forms of multilingual content and where are they on the internet? So for instance, a lot of languages that are primarily oral, that don't have a script, a lot of, like for instance, we have a lot of oral traditions, based on stories, based on narratives. So where do they find a space on the internet, right? And how do we document them if we do not have a form or a format on the internet that can actually sort of represent and translate them well? Right. I think preservation of languages was another key thematic that came up in, I think in both sort of projects. Where can the internet play a role in encouraging preservation and perpetuation of endangered and disappearing languages, particularly, right? So if you think of sort of the, not just preservation, but perpetuation, the use of a language also as a way to preserve it, right? The way that a lot of our sort of languages, stories, traditions have survived is because they have also been repeated, they have been passed down, they have been in many ways they have circulated in many ways, right? So once these stories and these languages reach the internet, how does the internet or how do digital technologies then help in essentially preserving, but also perpetuating, creating more access, creating more circulation and use of endangered and disappearing languages. Knowledge infrastructures, what are, say, new forms of content creation and use? So this is also connected again to what I was saying about oral cultures, for instance. Do we have audio content? Do we have content that is not primarily just visual or textual? And how can they be mediated? How can they be sort of facilitated by the internet and digital technologies, right? So, so I think one sort of very intriguing debate that's been going on Wikipedia has been about oral citations or audio citations, right? So, what is the sort of validity? What are sort of issues of authenticity that come up with something like oral citations? Regulation and governance structures, I think, form like a very key aspect of I think this discussion around languages, particularly. I think vulnerabilities, especially due to the lack of regulation and awareness, which tend to exacerbate invisibility and discrimination. So, for instance, like a very sort of straightforward instance would be something like a language filter on a lot of social media pages, right? So where there are instances of, say, online harassment, but say an app or a social media page is not able to filter that, or not able to pick it up because the harassment is actually in a particular language or in Indian language that it's not able to pick up, it's not able to recognize as sort of harassment, right? So I think these are sort of specific issues again related to languages and creating enough kind of documentation, enough content, enough structures, or like I said, infrastructure that takes into account how we're imagining the use of languages and the circulation of languages online. Copyright is another, very important area of work. Particularly, I think in the Wikimedia space, access to sort of content in Indian languages is quite difficult. You have to, apart from access to content, there is also the issue of copyright and lack of awareness also about IPR and copyright. and how to relicense your work. There's a lot of interesting work that is available in Indian languages, but also a sort of hesitation or a lack of understanding of how to relicense that content, how to make it freely available under an open license to something like Wikipedia, which would then make it again freely accessible, open for use to a much wider audience and to a much sort of wider public, right? So I think these are the challenges. So yeah, I think these are just sort of broad questions that I have picked up from the work that we've been doing in the last year or so, little more than a year or so, and I'm hoping that these sort of also inform some of the debates on digital humanities, specifically when we're thinking about infrastructure and what are sort of gaps, knowledge gaps related to infrastructure, and how do we think about, say, digital humanities, say, in an Indian context. Thank you so much.
As we are running out of time, we take up only few questions which we have received in the chat box.
We have two questions. The first question is for Lauren Klein. Can I go through with the question now? How does gender affect the data justice? And what are all the roles of feminist theories in improving data justice?
Those are both really good questions. And they're related, but they're actually two separate questions, right? So I talked a little bit at the beginning of the talk about how gender affects data justice. In a very obvious way, we don't have enough data involving gender in relation to almost everything. There's actually a wonderful NGO called Data 2X, which pretty much their entire mission is about collecting gender data with respect to any possible issue that anyone else might want to explore. And they both have documented the gaps in a lot of different areas and also tried to, through their own advocacy, fill in some of those gaps. With respect to theories of gender with respect to data justice, this is where, and this is kind of the intervention that we try to make in data feminism, both by saying, look, when there is gender inequality, it's not just a problem for gender minorities, it's a problem for anyone, because inequality and injustice in the world impacts everyone negatively. And so we should all aspire to more equitable conditions in the world with respect to gender and every other instance of sort of minority oppression that we face. The theoretical part, to me, is very interesting as someone who has a lot of training in literary theory, because, and this is something that I tried to get at towards the end of my talk, these ideas about inequality can be sort of abstracted and applied to other problem areas, right? So once you start to identify instances of equality, how they sort of why they originate and how they express themselves, you can start to take those same approaches to challenging gender inequality and apply them to these other instances that you have in the world. So the example that I gave, which remains a very powerful one, is sort of looking for these places where we feel like we've been given a false choice. You need to choose A or B, yes or no. With the assumption that like one choice is better, you need to make choices as to which is better than the other. And almost across the board, a feminist approach would say, you rarely need to choose. Rarely does doing one thing preclude doing the other thing as well. And if both of these things fulfill different missions, there is no problem at all with saying, I reject the idea that I need to say no to one thing because I'm saying yes to something else. And instead, I might just say, well, I'm going to pursue this pathway. Someone else might choose to pursue this other pathway. And taken together, that brings us closer to a shared goal. So I don't know if that was helpful to hear, but that's something that I do think about a lot.
Thank you so much. The next question to Sneha, ma'am. Can I go through the question, ma'am? Do the new digital infrastructure affect the social relationship? The social relationship, what we have in today's world, as per our feeling and as per our observation, it is failing when the digital infrastructure is starting or the platforms are accessible to each and everyone. People try to connect more in a digital infrastructure rather than the traditional one or old one. So in that perspective, is new digital infrastructures is affecting the social relationship?
Right. So yeah, I mean, so much of our everyday lives, that way is kind of really has been pervaded by different forms of digital infrastructures, right? So, whether it is the apps we use, whether it's in terms of the devices that we're using all the time. So I think definitely they do kind of help mediate our social relationships in different ways. I think particularly, a very interesting sort of thing to look at for this would be something like social media, would be, I think, messaging apps, like Facebook and Signal, and, in all of these spaces. And I think definitely, I think they do. I'm not sure if they change really the way that we interact. They definitely do mediate our different forms of interaction for sure. And I think that's something that, if you look at it, like if you look at, for instance, like a lot of work on digital migrants and digital natives, for instance, right? So which is a sort of really a term used for people who have digital migrants being people who have had to learn how to use technology, digital natives being really people who have grown up with this technology. So I think there is definitely a difference in the way, in terms of our use of and our comfort with technologies. But these technologies also grow and also evolve, and we've also been trying to, I think, trying to find ways to make them as comfortable and as sort of easy to use as possible. So that way, I think definitely they do kind of add a layer to the way that we interact with each other and how relationships are sort of mediated over the internet. So yeah, I think that's sort of my broad understanding of digital infrastructures and how they really kind of affect social interaction, let's say.
One more question to Sneha, madam. Is there any scope to give space to oral tradition in digital humanities?
Absolutely. I think there is, and there should be. I think with a lot of sort of work that we're doing right now, we're not seeing a lot more of that immediately, but there are definitely a lot of projects in different parts of the world, and I'm hoping, in India as well, that work on oral traditions, work on oral cultures. I think there are sort of specific challenges around that, particularly with technologies, in terms of documenting a lot of oral traditions. How do you kind of document them? How do you present them online? So I think, for example, even in the sort of report that we're doing on state of the internet's languages, there are 2 or 3 sort of projects there that actually very significantly draw from oral cultures and oral traditions, where people have been trying to kind of represent that in the online space by documenting sounds, by documenting signs, for instance, and translating that into a format that that can then sort of circulate on the internet. So yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much. This is from the interaction section. Over to Nikhil.
A small announcement before the vote of thanks. You will send the feedback form link now in the chat box as well as to your registered mail, which will be active for the next 48 hours. Kindly fill the same and send back for e-certificates. The e-certificates will reach you within the next 7 to 10 days. Very shortly, we will meet in one more international webinar of the Evening College, that is on the 4th of February 2021 on Thursday. The topic is Global Standards in Library Science in association with Myra School of Business, Mysuru, India.
Thank you, everyone. We are concluding the webinar.